Welcome everyone to this third public webinar on monitoring climate resilient water and sanitation and hygiene. This is jointly hosted by the WHO and UNICEF Joint Monitoring Program and GLAAS teams. My name is Bruce Gordon, and I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of WHO and UNICEF. I coordinate the WASH work at WHO headquarters. So today marks it's an important milestone. We've had a lot of a few public consultations so far and a lot of work behind the scenes. Last week we were at the UNC Water and Health Conference where we presented to plenary and had technical sessions. I think there was a lot of interest, and we're going to continue to globally have these public consultations. And right now we're at a point where we're looking at an emerging shortlist of candidate indicators for global monitoring. So we've I think had over 600 indicators that we've looked at so far, and many of them are very useful in some kind of settings, local settings. But now we're going to kind of zoom out a little bit to try to see what is applicable across all, sort of global monitoring. And this will mark a phase of shaping this next part of the initiative. So we're really pleased. I see some of our partners here from Leeds, Bristol, Oxford, and UTS, who are really doing a lot of the hard work putting this together, and we're guided and advised by a technical working group. And so I mentioned that there were 600 indicators, and I believe now, and we'll hear more, but it's somewhere around the 40s. So I think even specifically, I have a number for you, 44 candidates, so you can have a chance to look at that and give us your feedback. And I don't think I need to say why climate resilient monitoring is important. That's why you're here, but obviously we want to make sure that service providers are equipped to anticipate, respond, and adapt through good policies and strong institutions that are capacitated to do this. So the indicators we're discussing today really aim to capture resilience across the full WASH system, all the way from policy and finance to the user experience. So look forward to hearing your reflection. I hope the webinar works out, and I'm going to pass over to Fiona so she can give you a little bit of more of a introduction, and of course also go over the housekeeping. Okay, so over to you, Fiona.
Thank you, Bruce. And that was Bruce Gordon, Unit Head of the Water, Sanitation, Hygiene and Health at WHO. Thank you, Bruce, all the way back from Canada. Welcome back, and those of you that have just crossed the Atlantic, and welcome to all of you that have joined us from all over the world. Just a few housekeeping. I think you're not able to unmute yourself, so what we'd like to propose is that any questions you have, any reflections, reactions, please use the Q&A chat. As we go along, we're hoping to be able to have enough time to have a small session at the end of the webinar to be able to answer some of your questions. So keep those questions coming through the chat. Please keep your questions relevant to the topic of the webinar. If you are having technical problems, please do get in touch. And yeah, ask for assistance again in the chat. We are recording this webinar, just so you know, and it will be posted on the website. Now, regarding languages, this webinar will be in English. We are at this point with Teams unable to generate any live interpretation. However, depending on your Teams versions and computers, you may be able to generate some subtitles in different languages. So at the bottom here in red, those are possibly the means, then the buttons that you can press to try and get interpretation and subtitles in a different language, but you may not. In any case, what we plan to do once we post these webinars online is to add some subtitles, at least in 1 or 2 other languages. So with that, if we could go to the next slide, I'm really pleased to introduce to you who we have in the room with us today. As mentioned by Bruce, this project is being led by the joint WHO, UNICEF, GLAAS and JMP programs, and today we have both teams here. Just for reference, GLAAS is the UN Water Global Analysis and Assessment of Sanitation and Drinking Water, And the JMP is the Joint Monitoring Programme on Water Supply, Sanitation and Hygiene. And I'm really pleased to be here. I lead the GLAAS side to UNICEF. And I'm joined here on the GLAAS side and the GLAAS team by Marina Takane, and this afternoon, Betsy Ingebretson, who is also involved in this climate resilient work. And also this afternoon, Janet Atim at UNICEF is the focal point for GLAAS. On the other side, on the right-hand side, you will see we have Tom Slaymaker, who's the JMP lead on the UNICEF side. And with us this morning, we also have Rick Johnston from the JMP, who's the team lead on the WHO side. Now, with that, it is my pleasure to pass over to my colleague, Tom, so you get a bit of variety of us speaking this morning. Tom, are you with us?
Thanks, Fiona. So I'm going to briefly recap on the objectives of the review and the process that we've followed. So as you can tell, this topic of climate resilient WASH services is relevant to both the GLAAS and the JMP team. So we're looking at the inputs and the processes that the GLAAS team monitors, and also the sort of outputs and outcomes that the JMP has traditionally monitored. And this is the reason that we're working together on this joint review. The purpose was to really look at all of those frameworks and indicators and data collection opportunities, but also existing data that describe linkages between climate resilience and WASH. And so to do this, as Bruce mentioned, we advertised for partners, and we selected this consortium of research partners in early 2024. The team includes the Universities of Leeds and Bristol and Oxford, and also the University of Technology in Sydney. And we established a technical working group. The purpose of the technical working group is to provide inputs to the review, but also to review the outputs. And the ultimate objective here is really to identify those areas where GLAAS and JMP could focus their efforts for global monitoring in future. So although the review is drawing on experiences from a very wide range of settings and types of monitoring, right down to project or local scale monitoring, what we're ultimately interested in is drawing those concepts that can be used for national and for global monitoring. And we're committed to making this a very transparent process. We've had multiple opportunities to engage with different stakeholders. As Bruce mentioned, this is the third global webinar we've held so far, and we'll be launching this public consultation on the emerging shortlist of candidate indicators. And although it's very focused on WASH, what we're doing here is linked to a much wider discussion that is going on at the moment under the UNFCCC work stream around monitoring targets related to the global goal on adaptation, which, as many of you know, includes a thematic target 9A on water and sanitation. So we're hoping that what we do here will feed into that process. And the next steps for national and global monitoring of adaptation will be negotiated at the upcoming COP30 meeting in Brazil. Next slide, please. So we engaged the consortium in March last year, and shortly afterwards, we established our technical working group. We have about 20 people from all around the world with a very wide range of different types of experience, expertise in WASH, expertise in climate, expertise in data and monitoring. We had a kickoff meeting with the technical working group in July 2024, and then we held the first of these public webinars, launching the project and calling for stakeholders to submit indicators, frameworks, data, and relevant literature. And then from July through to the end of 2024, the research partners conducted a whole series of reviews, and Barbara will talk about this in a minute, both the peer-reviewed literature, grey literature, and also the things that were submitted through the public call. And these were then reviewed at our first meeting of the technical working group, which happened in December last year, and then shared in a second public webinar, which was held in February of this year. So if you can just click through, thank you. We then had a second technical working group meeting in March to review the long list of indicators which had resulted from these reviews. The technical working group looked at the long list, we made some refinements, and then we launched a public consultation on that long list of indicators. And then during the summer of 2025, we spent several months reviewing the feedback that we'd received on the long list, working together with the technical working group, and developing a short list of indicators that can be taken forward for pilot testing. So we had our third technical working group meeting in September to help to finalise this short list. And the purpose of this webinar really is to launch a second round of public consultations on this short list of indicators. Now, just to let you know, we do plan to take into account the feedback received today and after this webinar, and then to begin piloting the shortlisted indicators with interested countries in early 2026. And then we will convene another technical working group meeting later on to review the lessons learned from the piloting in 2026, 2027. So as you can see, it's been an iterative process, a highly consultative process, and it's designed to build consensus around this core set of priority indicators that can be used by JMP and GLAAS for global monitoring of climate resilient WASH. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Barbara, who's going to recap on what came out of the reviews and the conceptual framework that we've been using for this review. Barbara.
Thanks so much, Tom, and good morning to everybody who's online. It's really exciting to see people chatting, introducing themselves in the chat. Please keep that coming, because it's good to know that we're speaking to a really diverse group of stakeholders with a wealth of expertise. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about two things. One is the conceptual framework that we use for this programme, and the second is the process of reviewing. So the first thing I just wanted to mention is that the work I'm presenting is a product of the JMP and GLAAS teams that you've already met, plus this incredible galaxy of brilliant researchers who have all collectively been contributing to the development of the framework for what we've done and the review process. So if we go on to the next slide, let's start with the conceptual framework. So the first thing to say is, I'm not quite sure what's happening with the slides, but never mind. So the first thing to say is that when we think about resilience of infrastructure, often people think about the attributes of infrastructure, so whether or not things are built robustly, and we might also think about the service outcomes, so whether or not services are interrupted. And sometimes, if we expand that a little bit, we also think about the actions of service providers that can help to result in resilience. And this sort of framework is something that's come up a lot when we do the reviews. A lot of thinking in the sector thinks like this. However, in our thinking about this, we are expanding our systems thinking a little bit. So if we click to the next one, we started to think about the fact, of course, that WASH doesn't exist in isolation from the watershed and the wider water system. So we have to think about attributes of the watershed which contribute to climate resilience. Click. And then if we expand that a little bit further, we also conceptually understand that the policy, institutions, regulatory and financial environment does have a very strong influence on the way that service providers act, and on the types of infrastructure which are built. If we click a little bit further, we can also consider that those PIRF actions, those actions by government, also have an influence on the extent to which the WASH sector is embedded within and coordinated with water resources management, drainage and solid waste, all of which have an influence on the resilience, particularly important for climate resilience. Finally, we can't forget that there are users and people in the system. So we also have to build into our understanding of resilience the role that users play in being adaptable, and also ultimately the way in which users experience the service. So in our framing, we're going beyond service outcomes in terms of, does your water system keep delivering water? And we're also really reaching into the arena where we ask about users' own experience, the level of certainty and confidence, or conversely stress, which users experience as a result of being able to cope or not being able to cope with climate shocks and stresses. I just also want to touch very briefly on the fact that we are interested in both rapid onset climate events, so floods, storms, wildfires, and slow onset climate events such as droughts and sea level rise. So within all of this, we're not just thinking about disaster response, we are really thinking about the way in which this whole system is impacted by all of the different weather effects which are a result of climate change. Okay, going on to the next slide. We took this framework and, oh yes, sorry. I wanted to also say that we have been very explicit that there are some things which are excluded from our framing, not because they're not important, but because they lie outside the remit of the WASH sector. So we know that the resilience of the wider governance system and the adaptive capacity of service providers and users in general is important. But that is a general societal artifact, not something that's specifically related to the WASH sector. Similarly, on water resources, we are really interested in water resources issues that relate specifically to the delivery of drinking water and the provision of safe sanitation. But we're not including indicators for broader water resources resilience or transboundary water issues. And I want to emphasize it's not because those things aren't important, it's simply because they lie outside the remit of the GLAAS and the JMP. Another point that people often ask us about is mitigation and emissions. We are interested in resilience using the UN definition of resilience that seeks to achieve resilience while minimizing emissions, but the specific measurement of emissions or the reduction of emissions outside the remit of achieving adaptive resilience is not included in this work. So emissions are important, but they're not central. So if we go on to the next slide, what did we do? The first thing we did is we took this framework, and as Rick said, we did a long period of asking you all to provide us with your resources and work that had previously been done, and an enormously rich database of material was provided, which we sifted through. We also carried out 3 systematic reviews to generate new evidence, looking for the evidence that links adaptation actions or the attributes of systems to their performance under climate-related stresses. And we did a review for sanitation, we did one for hygiene, and we did one for the WASH sector in general. We also carried out 2 further reviews that weren't systematic reviews, but were sifting through the wealth of material that already existed. One was an umbrella review specifically for water supply. We didn't do a new systematic review for water supply because there have been several. And we did a scoping review on how resilience is conceptualized, both in the WASH sector and in adjacent sectors such as the health sector and energy. Next click. Taking all of that together, we identified 2 sets of things. One was a set of objectives. So those are the things which can be achieved in each of the components of that framework that I just showed you. So the things that the desirable objectives that you might be looking to achieve, which we would hypothesize are going to lead to resilience. And then using those, click, we identified any indicators or indicatory things, as Rick will often say, things that look like indicators, which could be good measures of those objectives being achieved. And in the first round, we had 600 candidate indicators. Okay, so now I can go on and tell you what we did next. I think I'm hitting my time targets. If we go to the next slide, we obviously didn't want to be sitting here today talking to you about 600 candidate indicators. We have shared these lists, and many of you have engaged through this process of whittling down. I want to particularly acknowledge the very generous amount of time that many of you spent looking at our 2.0 list, which still had 422 indicators in it. That was an enormously complex task, and we got some incredibly valuable feedback from everybody there. Using the feedback from the global consultation and inputs from our technical working group, we have been progressively reducing and rationalizing this list. So all through, we've been looking for indicators which are measuring important things, but we're also trying to examine the balance across the whole framework, because we really are clear that resilience is a systemic thing, and we really want to be able to track how resilience manifests right across that framework that I mentioned. We're also looking for balance between rapid and slow onset events. We were also always checking to make sure that we were genuinely thinking about water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. And then we had a couple of other cross-cutting issues. For example, we know that equity is extremely important. So we were also checking through to make sure that we hadn't left out some of the core attributes of WASH, which are central to the sort of philosophy of the SDGs and which are reflected in existing GLAAS and JMP indicators. We wanted a lot of that to make sure that that came through in this special additional list that we're developing for climate resilient WASH. I think that was my last slide. I always find it quite difficult. Oh yes. So now I think I can hand over to Marina, who has the exciting task of starting to show you the indicators which are on our shortlist. We're going to introduce all 44 indicators to you, and we're going to start at the left-hand end of our framework with the PIRF indicators, including 2 finance indicators. Over to Marina.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So as Barbara said, I'll be starting us off with the indicators related to policies, institutions, regulation, and finance. So the upstream adaptation actions by national and subnational government. Next slide, please. So these enabling environment type indicators. I think there's a slide before this, if I'm not mistaken, but basically these enabling environment type indicators that are most relevant to the monitoring done through GLAAS. So just a note on how we're presenting the indicators. So we have the indicator objectives that Barbara just mentioned on the left and the candidate indicators on the right. Each of the indicators has an ID number, which indicates, so the first digit indicates the part of the conceptual framework into which the indicator falls. So here, since policy is the first component, all of these indicators start with a 1, so sort of in this 100 range. And noting as well that none of these indicators have been finalized, they are still being refined, and of course would need clear definitions, metadata, etc. But that would be very much one of the objectives in the next phase, closely linked to the country pilots. And so really what we're trying in this phase is to have a reasonably short list, list of candidate indicators that we can take forward for the country piloting. And I see that there are questions already coming in through the chat. You can also put in questions through the Q&A function, but encouraging you basically to continue putting your questions in as we are presenting. So I'll start. We have under policy, we have 5 indicators in the shortlist. The first 2 indicators are shown here. So the first indicator 101 on WASH sector policies and plans. You'll note that it's sort of a multi-factor indicator. There are sort of multiple elements that are included in this indicator. You'll note that as we go through the indicators, we do have quite a few of these indicators that are, sort of composite or multi-level or stacked indicators. And so the aim would be to define these as and condense them into a single index with multiple levels. The second indicator is on the use of risk-based management plans. So for example, water safety plans or sanitation safety plans that take into account current and future climate. And you will see that these risk-based management plans are referenced in downstream indicators. Next slide, please. The next two indicators are linked to national climate resilience planning. So we have indicator 103 on national adaptation plans and 106 on mitigation plans. And noting that this indicator 106 is the only indicator that we have on the shortlist that references emissions. As Barbara noted, this is, it was outside the scope of the review. However, just recognizing the importance of measuring emissions, we have retained this one indicator in the shortlist. Next slide, please. And then we have the fifth indicator under policy is on equity. So ensuring that climate resilient WASH investments are focused on vulnerable populations and those disproportionately affected by climate change. I just wanted to give one example of an indicator that was not retained on the shortlist. So this indicator looking at prioritization of domestic water use over other water uses in resource allocations. This was included in a sort of a previous longer list, and it is a promising indicator, but we don't have the resources to develop all of the promising indicators, so this indicator has dropped out. And noting as well that as we've gotten to successively smaller or shorter lists of indicators, that the indicators that are sort of more specific have tended to drop out, or we have sort of generalized some of the concepts within the indicators as we have developed successively shorter lists. Next slide, please. Under institutions, we have 3 indicators. So this first one is on the use of climate data and seasonal forecasts. Again, this is a stacked or composite indicator with multiple levels. And so looking at whether the data are downscaled and accessible for use by WASH sector stakeholders, if it's accessible, relevant to WASH service delivery, etc. Next slide, please. And then the next 2 indicators under institutions, looking at the existence of multi-hazard early warning systems, indicator 202, and then 203 on WASH, on national WASH monitoring systems. Noting that in indicator 203 that we're looking at whether the monitoring systems collect data on the impact of climate on WASH services. We're not specifying here like which or what type of impacts, just that that the monitoring systems do track these impacts. Next slide, please. We have 3 indicators under regulation. These are all about the existence of standards and regulation. So 301 on design and construction of resilient infrastructure, 302 on operations and maintenance, and then 303 on restoration of services following a climate event. And you'll note as well that these standards and regulations are referenced in some of the downstream indicators, notably under attributes of infrastructure. And then finally, next slide, we have 2 indicators under finance. So 401 looking at budget allocation, so looking at how the budget allocated compares to total annual costs identified for WASH climate adaptation. And then 403 on expenditure. As we know that not all budgeted funds are always fully utilized, we want to know about both. So that takes us through the 13 indicators under the PIRF, or the Enabling Environment Indicators. And with that, I am going to hand back to Barbara to take us through the indicators on adaptation actions. Back to you, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Marina. And just to point out, if you notice in the top right-hand corner of these slides, there's a helpful little navigation tool that allows you to see where we've gone. So Marina was walking us through all the indicators at the extreme left-hand side of the framework, and now we are on to the next step down, which is essentially adaptation actions by, firstly, hygiene promoters and supply chain actors. And in this category here, we have one indicator. There were a lot of candidates in this area. The one that was seemed most robust, and that most of the advisory group and members of the general public had commented on favourably, was this one, the proportion of the population where there are well-defined event-specific preparedness plans. And that's about ensuring that there's key messaging on hygiene behaviour and a stockpiling and storing of hygiene products in areas which are going to be affected by climate-related weather events or wildfires. Moving on, we have a set of 4 indicators which are about adaptation actions by service providers. The first are a matched pair. There are a lot of pairs of indicators where for both water supply and sanitation, we have selected an indicator about using risk management plans. So for water supply, for example, the use of climate resilient water safety plans, although that's only an example, and for sanitation, the use of flood and drought preparedness plans. So the idea here is that there is proactive management ahead of potential changes, so that service providers are able to adapt rapidly, but also are making investments that are taking into account future risks. Moving on, the second pair are about operation and maintenance standards. So one of the things that we really have embraced in this process, and has come out very clearly in the reviews, is that operations and maintenance behaviour by service providers is at least as important, and possibly more important than the original decisions about what types of infrastructure are built. So we were really keen to have 2 indicators that really ask whether those national standards for operations and maintenance that Marina talked about in the regulatory set are being implemented by service providers on the ground. So that's what this pair of indicators are doing. And you can see these threads going through, which link from right through the framework, which is why the framework exists. Moving on, we have a set of indicators which are about coordination with other sectors. The first 2 are about coordination with water resources management. And here we are interested in, again, a sort of pair of indicators. The first question is whether investment in operational plans for water supply and sanitation and wastewater management reference and are linked to, if you like, so the reference is the indicator that they're linked to operational plans for water resources management. So we want to see tangible evidence that the WASH sector is attending to the wider water resources management arena. And similarly, we want to ask whether in catchments, water resources management plans are addressing climate risks to water supply and sanitation. So we want to know if water supply and sanitation are really being taken into account by water resources management plans. So that's, again, a pair of indicators that look at the same question from 2 ends of the telescope, if you like. Moving on. Similarly, we have one indicator for drainage and solid waste management. So again, here we're trying to get to the question of whether the WASH sector is really well engaged with planning around solid waste management. And when we say solid waste management here, we mean municipal solid waste management. Obviously, within the wider concept of sanitation in this whole project, there was a question earlier. We are, of course, interested in the whole wastewater stream, so solid materials coming from the sanitation system and liquids. But here we're asking, is that whole management system also attending to what's going on with solid waste management and drainage? So again, whether or not investment in operational plans for our sector are really referencing what's going on in the drainage sector. Going on to the next set. We have 3 indicators which are specifically about the attributes of water resources as they pertain to water supply specifically and wastewater. The first is about what proportion of raw water intakes, so essentially surface water intakes or groundwater boreholes, meet design quality standards. So that's water quality standards. So this one gets at whether or not we are achieving whether water quality at the place where we source our water is declining or holding its quality. 1303 looks at the same question, but here we're interested in water quantity. And then back on the water quality side, we have a separate, an additional indicator, which is looking at incidents of non-compliance relating to water quality downstream of wastewater treatment plants. So that one is getting to the question of whether we're managing our sanitation systems, taking into account both the load on our sanitation systems and downstream conditions in water bodies, particularly rivers or lakes, and that we are not creating pollution incidents, particularly relating to nutrients in downstream waters. So those are the set of 3 that are about the attributes of water resources. In terms of attributes of infrastructure, we have 4. Here we see the pair which ask whether the infrastructure that we're building is conforming to the national regulations and standards that Marina mentioned to start with. And these are essentially asking whether we're designing systems that take current and future climate into account, design and construction details. Going to the next one, we have a similar attributes indicator for hygiene. But we've separated it into 2. We're asking specifically about schools in 1601 and healthcare facilities in 1602. And again, we're asking whether or not the hygiene services that are provided, hand washing stations, provision of soap, all of those are taking into account current and future climate. So we're not asking about specific types of infrastructure, because we recognize that the types of infrastructure that will give you resilience will be very context specific. After this, I think I'm going to pass back to Rick, who's going to talk to us about service outcomes.
Thank you, Barbara. So as you can see on the little icons above, we're now passing to the right of the framework and looking at 8 indicators, proposed indicators around service functioning. The first 2 are related to the existing global indicators of basic or safely managed drinking water services in households, in schools, in healthcare facilities. These are things that are already being integrated into national monitoring systems and tracked by governments, but we adapted them here to specify how many people, schools, or healthcare facilities are accessing those levels of surface within nationally determined climate hazard zones. So for instance, what proportion of households living in flood-prone areas or drought-prone areas have safely managed drinking water services? And this does presume that countries have determined climate hazard zones, but that again links back to some of the policy indicators like number 105 on identifying priority vulnerable populations. Now, this is not easy to do. There are some real technical challenges. Right now, most countries can't map safely managed services at a subnational level, but we think it is a reasonable ambition to set. And also these indicators should be useful for tracking both rapid and slow onset events. And on the next slide, you can see a corresponding hygiene indicator about having access to soap and water at a hand washing facility, again, within nationally determined climate hazard zones. Then we move into indicators around damage and disruption. So here you see a pair that are related to indicators drawn from the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And by the way, that global framework has 38 indicators. So this list of 44 is very much in the same league. And one of the Sendai indicators is about damage to critical infrastructure, including schools and healthcare facilities, that can be attributed to disasters. So we've made these a little bit more specific to refer to domestic water supply and sanitation infrastructure, and we feel that these will be very relevant to the whole discourse on loss and damage related to climate. Next, we have a set of 3 indicators around disruptions to services. These are also related to Sendai indicators, and they're distinct from the damage indicators. We propose a hygiene indicator around disruptions to access to soap and water, but you may have noticed we didn't propose one on the last slide about damage to infrastructure. And it's not that hygiene infrastructure can't be damaged due to climate events, but hygiene infrastructure tends to be primarily at the household level or at the school or healthcare facility, whereas water and sanitation infrastructure includes larger engineered systems like treatment plants and distribution lines that are more salient for damages. Note also that we haven't specified what time period or recall period would be appropriate. We talk about in the last Y. That's the kind of detail we would work on in indicator development over the next year. Now let's move to user experiences, the last component of our framework. The user experiences really matter and are a good composite indicator of both the extent to which services are maintained and the confidence that households or individuals have in coping during a crisis. So this first set are focused on the availability of alternative services when primary facilities or services are unusable because of a climate event, especially a rapid onset event. So these link very closely to the previous slide with indicators about service disruption. Then on the next slide, we propose two indicators about hygiene. These are about the ease with which people can access critical hygiene materials for hand washing, as well as for menstrual hygiene management before, during, and after climate events. Then we have a pair of indicators that are really more about, oh, one before, please. Previous slide. Yes, there you go. No, the ones 2001 and 2101, which are about the experience of distressed. No, not that one. 2001, there you go. That's it. These are about the experience of distress related to service disruptions. Do people feel worried about not having enough water to meet all of their needs? Do people feel safe when they're using a sanitation location that might not be their usual one due to a climate event? And these are built out from the work done over the past 10 or so years on water insecurity experiential scales, or the WISE scales. Then we do have a last set of indicators which are related to complaints received by service providers or by regulators, 2004 and 2103. So how many complaints are received? Are those analyzed? Are they acted upon by service providers? And this is the type of information that we feel could come relatively easily from regulators or service providers. And if these are routinely collected, it would be possible to do a special round of data collection after a rapid onset climate event, like a flood, to measure the impact of that event. All right, let's move to this final slide. This is a mapping of all those 44 indicators across the entire conceptual framework. You can see there's quite a lot in the policy, institutions, regulation, and finance area, but also good numbers spread through the other components, quite a lot also in service outcomes and user experience. The things on the left side are more what the GLAAS initiative tends to measure, and the right tends to be more GMP style indicators. And in the middle, there could be some overlap. You'll notice there's one component that doesn't have any shortlisted indicators. That's adaptation actions by users. We did review some candidate indicators, and you'll see that set in the long list, which is available in the document that I shared. But we didn't find one that we thought was ready for development into global indicators. But we would really like to hear from you over the coming weeks about this draft shortlist and the distribution of indicators across the framework. So now let me hand over to Fiona to talk about that consultation process.
Thanks very much, Rick. Fantastic. And thank you to Marina, Barbara, and Rick for those details on all the indicators that have been shortlisted. So as Rick has mentioned, the JMP and GLAAS teams are really pleased to launch this public consultation on the draft shortlist of candidate indicators, and there's 44 candidate indicators that would be used for global monitoring of climate resilient WASH. So we are seeking your review on these. And we'd like to know if the list is too long, and if so, how could it be reduced? Which ones would you suggest eliminating? Or is anything critical missing? And we'd really like you to share your suggestions of how we could fill these gaps. And also, I think this relates to a comment that came in the chat from Eric, I think, about, you know, the definition of indicators. We note that, and we recognise that the detailed formulation of many of these candidate indicators still need improvement, and that's something we would be working on in one of the objectives during the country piloting plan for 2026. So there's still quite a lot of work to be done, but there's also a lot of information on the website, and Rick has been putting the links in the chat. So we also, to note on this consultation, we're really interested to hear from you and to ensure that the shortlist is well balanced among the different framework components. And as you could see, we walked you through the different components: water, sanitation and hygiene, but also rapid and slow onset event. So we'd like to ask you to send any feedback on the shortlist or any opportunities for country pilots, and we're really pleased, Alban, thank you for your suggestion to discuss further of potentially having a pilot in Angola. That's really fantastic. If there's other countries that may be interested in further discussing with us pilot testing these indicators, we'd be really pleased. So please add that in the chat. So if you could send any feedback on the shortlist or any opportunities for country piloting to washmonitoring@who.int, or to fill out this simple survey. And I think Rick has put, or is putting in the chat, the link to this feedback form. And I think, Dave, we no longer can see the slides on screen, so just wanted to point that out. Also that this, to note very importantly, that this public consultation will take place from today, yes, it's today, 5th of November, to the end of this month, and the 30th of November. So that gives us a good sort of 3 weeks ahead to receive your feedback, for you to look at this in more detail, digest the indicators, and we really look forward to receiving your feedback. And I think with that, we have a few minutes maybe for Q&A. And I'm just noting that there's been a few questions and some really great feedback, and some very positive feedback as well, on some of the wording and how we've organised the various indicators across the framework. I'm just looking. I think, Tariq, you've also provided some really sort of insightful feedback, like schools, health facilities need more resilient wash services and facilities more than ever before as post-COVID era. Hope that indicators are inclusive and comprehensive. And yes, we have tried to be as inclusive and comprehensive across the various indicators, the framework. And I'm also looking at Nick, you've also been asking some very good questions. Eric asked about sharing the indicator definitions for these indicators. I've addressed that. And there's Saidi, Khadija, are there indicators focusing on community and household level? Maybe I could turn to you, Barbara, to just maybe mention the assignment we did, with the core set of indicators when we had approximately 100, and going global and more sort of local. Do you want to say a few words about that, Barbara?
Yes, absolutely. I was just typing, but you've saved me the typing. Yes, thanks, Khadija. It's a really good question. So the first thing to say is that exactly as Fiona said, in the review we found a large number of very sensible things that you might want to measure. And some of them would be very useful things to measure if you were running a project or programme at national or subnational level, or indeed at community level. So on the list of 105, I think we have on the full list, there are some indicators there which we haven't chosen as candidates to go forward to be developed for piloting as global indicators, but they're on that list because we think they are very important, useful things that you could build into local M&E systems to assess the climate resilience of a community scale intervention. The second thing I just wanted to emphasize is that even in the global set, we are particularly interested at the right-hand end of our framework in the lived experience of households who live within the community. So we were trying to, although the left-hand end of the framework kind of starts at the very high level with your regulatory drivers of resilience, what we actually are, everything that we're all trying to achieve, I think, is that the experience that users have in the face of increasing climate stress is not an increase in their own stress, anxiety, uncertainty, or inability to provide services to themselves. So we're really trying to keep people and the outcome for people, both in terms of services and user experience, at the centre of the process. I hope that answers the question. Back to you, Fiona.
Super. You're getting some claps and some thumbs up, so I think it is answering the question. Picking up maybe on a couple more questions that came through the chat, and I do apologize if I haven't picked up all of them, but I think Edwin Nabimanya, I think, Barbara, you've already been answering some of the questions through the chat, but one of them at the very beginning, and maybe it might be worth sort of re-emphasizing this, is he was noting, I hope that the sanitation result area covers various sanitation products, including solid and liquid waste other than excreta. Maybe if we want to just maybe re-emphasize that point, Barbara, or yeah?
Well, I would, yes, exactly. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Rick or Tom will be able to recall, there is a UN definition of resilient development, which is about achieving resilience while minimizing or optimizing emissions. I can't quite remember the correct wording. And that's been our philosophy. So one of the things that's very important is if a national government were to say that their national regulation for design and construction of WASH is for climate resilient sanitation systems of a particular type, which also minimize emissions, then all the monitoring that follows through the framework, asking whether those systems have actually been built, if the attributes of the infrastructure meet those regulations, would then be picking up those emissions objectives. So I think emissions are actually there more frequently than you might think, but we have left it a little bit flexible because it will be very dependent on national government strategies, the extent to which that is embedded into national regulations for climate resilient WASH. So, and we do have that one very specific indicator in the policy group that asks whether or not WASH is being properly attended to in national mitigation planning, and of course that would follow on into nationally determined contribution reporting. I don't know if anyone else wants to add, Rick or Tom, if you want to add on that point, because we have thought about this one a lot.
Rick, Tom, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's a very good summary. There are a series of comments or questions about what is the ideal number of indicators that we're aiming for, which is a very good question. It's also one of the questions for the consultation. So, you know, how many indicators do we think is enough? Our purpose is to try and identify this kind of core set or this minimum set that would be sufficient for monitoring, you know, climate resilient WASH at national and global levels. Now, that is as a WASH sector, we should be thinking about, you know, what do we need to monitor this topic, which we all agree is very important. So I'd be very interested to get feedback on that. Is the current list too long? Can it be shortened? Or are there any critical things that are missing that need to be added? That would be a very interesting discussion. But we also expect that some of these indicators could be taken and used for some of these bigger cross-sectoral monitoring processes, such as the Global Goal and Adaptation. We would not expect all of this short list of indicators to be used for those global processes. This is primarily focused on what we need as a WASH sector. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. I'm also noting that this sort of relates to some of the questions that Nick, thanks Nick for all your questions and great questions as always, and wondering if there's been any thinking about links back to more rights-based approaches. And you know, how data can be used by users and other stakeholders, and I think these are very sort of excellent questions that we'd love to get feedback on, and do send us your questions and your remarks and reflections, because this is really to keep us sort of looking at our shortlisted candidate indicators and having a look to make sure that we've considered all these really important aspects. I think you have also particularly, Nick, a question on how do you deal with changes in design production rates for indicator 1303. This seems like a moving target over time. I realise that the interpretation here is loose. Is design amounts from construction, rehabilitation, or can it be adjusted anytime? I wonder if there's anybody on the team that wants to, has courage in taking on Nick's question on 1303. I see Barbara potentially wanting to.
If I want to, I'm not sure I ever want to take on Nick. Nick with a formidable brain. I think the movability is actually intentional, because the point is that your design parameters, the point about climate change is in some places design parameters are going to be changing quite fast. So that question would be asked in the context of, first of all, at the right hand end of the framework, do you have standards which relate to the current reality? And then at the point where you're monitoring, is the implementation matching your intentional policy position on design standards? So yes, it would change over time. And that's one of the reasons why we have these indicators framed in terms of the extent to which services are meeting standards which have been determined in the policy framing, because we recognise that different countries are going to be approaching that that policy framing slightly differently. That sounds like a bit of a weaseling out of the question, but it's really not intended to be. So the idea is that, you know, if you measured 1 year in one place, you might have a particular parameter that you're measuring for a particular system. In 5 years' time, the parameter that enables you to say yes or no to that indicator may well have changed, and that would be part, if that's part of an attention to being climate resilient, that would be fine. So yes, it is a moving target, but it's meant to be a moving target.
Great, thank you, Barbara. I think we're slowly coming to the end of this webinar, but the last one that I'm going to turn to Tom to is about the alignment with the GGA indicators. And I think you mentioned this at the very beginning of the webinar, Tom, but I think it may be good for us to just come back on the GGA process and alignment with the work that we're doing. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. So the Global Goal on Adaptation has a large number of targets looking at the policy dimensions, but also different themes. And one of the themes is water and sanitation. So there is a process to develop a set of indicators that could be used to monitor the targets under the Global Goal on Adaptation. And there is a proposed list of around 100 indicators which will be discussed at the COP meeting in Brazil. And in that list, you will find that the expert group has made linkages to the JMP and GLAAS joint review and has recommended that the Global Goal on Adaptation should build on whatever recommendations come out of this process. So we're hoping that there will be a strong link between the two. Of course, for the Global Goal on Adaptation, there will probably only be a small number of indicators on WASH, because there can only be around 10 on water and sanitation and no more than 100 for the whole framework. So exactly which indicators are taken up remains to be seen, but we have tried to make sure that these processes are linked up and are mutually reinforcing. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. I see somebody is putting their hand up, but please note that you're unable to unmute yourself. So please, if you can put your question in the chat. We are now coming to the end of this morning's webinar. Thank you for joining us. If we can go to the next slide, just to thank the teams, the consortium, Barbara and her teams, but also to our donors, and please sign up to receive any updates. We've also got QR code for the project website, and noting that we will be happy and pleased to receive your feedback and some excellent reflections that you've already provided us with today, and incorporate them in our thinking and in the next revision for the shortlist of candidate indicators. You have until the 30th of November, so we look forward to getting your feedback, and please do send it to washmonitoring@who.int. I think with that, we're going to close today's webinar. Thank you for your active participation, for your excellent reflections, questions that will really help contribute, move this work forward. With that, I'd like to say thank you. Bruce, do you want to say a word to close?
Well, I was just looking at all this congratulations, and I think everyone's excited by it. So yeah, just to say to everyone, thank you for being with us on this journey, and it will be exciting to see this all come together. So, and we have another one this afternoon if anyone wants to hear it again.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and keep in touch. Thank you.
Bye-bye.